Hello again, biology pupils. Mr. Kinnear here with another video lesson for higher biology, Unit 3, Sustainability and Interdependence. And today we're looking at symbiosis, which is key area 3.5. And again, this nicely links on to previous topics. There's a particular element of symbiosis, which you'll see later, which links directly into food security and food production. Symbiosis may be a word you've heard of before. It's the relationship between two different species that live in direct contact with each other. And the picture here of a clownfish and an anemone is a really good example. Something they actually talk about at the start of Finding Dory. So Marlin and Nemo can quite happily swim about in the fronds of the anemone, whereas when Dory swims in, he gets stung. So the relationship with clownfish can hide and shelter within an anemone. The anemone benefits from being cleaned by the clownfish. So this is a relationship that is intimate and it's evolved over millions of years. And the co-evolution of adaptations is important, as a change in one will affect the survival of the other. So they're very much co-dependent and co-evolved over millions of years. And we're going to look at two different categories of symbiosis. Parasitism, which is a word you've probably heard of. One organism, the parasite, benefits at the expense of the other organism, the host, which is often damaged. And that's then a dependent relationship. The other one, mutualism, is probably not a word you've heard of, but that's where both organisms benefit from the relationship. So this is an interdependent relationship. So in parasitism, the parasite derives its nutrition from the host, which it exploits, and the host is harmed or at least loses some energy or materials to the parasite. And parasites themselves often possess a limited metabolism, so that most of them do not cause the host to die, or at least not until the completion of the life cycle is ensured. So that co-evolution is something you look at further at advanced higher biology, and we talk about how this continual battle of these two organisms evolving so that they both still are able to survive. So the evolution of both are so closely linked together. So here's some examples of parasitism. Unfortunately, the pictures might make your skin crawl a little bit. So some live and feed outside the body, so such as mosquitoes, fleas and aphids. And aphids do a similar job to plants that mosquitoes do to animals. So they'll feed on the sugary sap of plants. And some will live and feed inside the body. Examples of liver fluke, a tapeworm and plasmodium, which is connected to malaria. Now the tapeworm is something we've actually seen come back, not in fashion per se, but some diet pills, dodgy diet pills that you might find on the internet, actually contain tapeworm eggs. And tapeworms can grow to roughly about 6 feet, a couple of meters, inside your intestines. And obviously as a parasite, what they're doing is they're feeding on the contents of your intestine. So they're taking nutrition and food from your intestine. So as a diet pill, I guess it does do a job in that it stops you getting the nutrients that you are consuming in your food. However, it's a particularly dangerous and dodgy way of doing it. I'm sure there are better ways to lose weight than giving yourself a tapeworm. So the transmission or movement of the parasite from one host to the next can be done by several different mechanisms. There's the basic direct contact, such as lice passing from person to person. And that will happen within a classroom. Primary school, nursery schools will have that quite regularly. If one person in the class has got lice, then it's quite likely that it'll transmit to everyone. Release of resistant stages, so these are able to survive adverse conditions before being picked up by a new host. Or you can also have a vector, so such as mosquitoes that carry the plasmodium, which causes malaria. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail. Malaria is caused by a plasmodium. It's not caused by the mosquitoes directly. They are the vector. So they would inject the plasmodium into the host as they go to feed from the blood. That plasmodium then moves to the liver and divides repeatedly. When the liver cell bursts, the plasmodium enters red blood cells and other liver cells. And when those cells burst, the last two steps are repeated. And then another mosquito comes along and feeds on that host again, sucking up the red blood cells containing plasmodia, which then again can go and be passed on to the next person that is fed upon by that mosquito. At this stage, we'll move on to mutualism. And I said right at the start of the lesson that there's an element of symbiosis that's directly related to food security and food production. And it comes down to this mutualistic relationship within cellulose digestion in our cows and other ruminants. So many herbivores actually lack the genes to produce cellulose digesting enzymes. So cellulose being the complex carbohydrate that makes up cell walls. So glucose, the product of photosynthesis, is converted into cellulose in plants. So the herbivores have special gut chambers that contain cellulose digesting microorganisms. So the microbes convert cellulose into simple sugars, which can be used by the ruminant, the cow in these examples, as an energy source. And in exchange, the microbes are getting protection, warmth, and a constant supply of food. And the cows are then able to eat grass all day long, digest the cellulose, and get their energy. We, as humans, obviously depend on these animals for food. Therefore, the microbes themselves are a huge economic importance. Again, as I said, relating directly back to our food security. So that's a great example of a mutualistic relationship. Another great example of mutualism is coral polyps. So living coral organisms are animals, and they're called polyps, and they can generate the calcium carbonate skeleton, which creates the coral reefs. And they'll feed with kind of feather-like projections that waft around in the moving water, picking up all sorts of tiny organisms in the water. But they also benefit from a mutualistic relationship with photosynthesizing algae. Again, those are tiny organisms that shelter within and between the cells of the polyps. So obviously they get shelter, and the polyps get the extra carbohydrates produced from photosynthesis within the algae. And that brings us to the end of the lesson. So today we've looked at symbiotic relationships which have evolved over millions of years, with the survival of each organism closely linked. And that co-evolution is something we'll look at further at advanced higher biology. The parasitic organisms can often not survive without the host and therefore benefit from not killing it. And mutualistic relationships are interdependent. Both organisms are benefiting from it. The two examples being microorganisms in the guts of cows and the relationship between coral polyps and photosynthesizing algae. So hopefully you found that informative and interesting. Obviously, as always, if you have any problems, questions or queries, give me a shout and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.